Welcome to Midnight Ember Studios.
Most women want his crown, but she only wanted his heart. My stepsister thought she could buy his loyalty with a scandal, but she forgot one thing. Vincenzo doesn't protect assets, he destroys anyone who touches his light. You didn't just steal her designs, he whispered, his voice a blade against her throat. You signed your own exile. The grand ballroom of the Shin estate was a sea of velvet and diamonds. Vincenzo stood on the mezzanine, his eyes fixed on Mina. She was dressed in a simple, hand-sewn silk gown of deep emerald, looking like a quiet forest fire in a room full of artificial lights. He didn't care about the governors or the rival capos in the room. He only cared that Mina was safe. She's out of her depth, Vin, a sharp, honeyed voice interrupted. Sloane stepped beside him, her dress a blinding sequined crimson that demanded attention. She slid a hand onto his arm, her eyes flashing with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. A girl like Mina belongs in a sewing room, not on the arm of a king. I could help you run this city. I know the players, I know the game. Vin didn't move his arm, but his voice turned into a razor. You know the game, Sloane, but you don't know the cost. Mina isn't in her depth because I am the depth, and she is the only reason I haven't let the tide take this whole city yet. He stepped away, leaving Sloane standing alone in the spotlight, her face twisting into a mask of cold, silent fury. Sloane knew she couldn't win Vin's heart through grace, so she decided to destroy Mina's reputation. Mina had been working on a secret design project, a collection that would allow her to finally be financially independent of the Shin family. Late at night, Sloane broke into Mina's studio. She didn't just steal the designs, she leaked them to a rival fashion house owned by Vin's biggest enemy. The next morning, the scandal broke. Mina was accused of plagiarism. Her career was dying before it began. I can fix this, Sloane whispered to Vin in his private study, leaning over his desk. I can make the headlines go away. I can give you the leverage to crush that rival house. All you have to do is let Mina go. She's a liability now. She's a scandal. I am an asset. Vin looked at the evidence on his desk. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. You think I value assets over loyalty, Sloane? You think I'm a businessman before I am a man. Vin didn't use his lawyers to fix the scandal. He used his shadows. Within 3 hours, his men had recovered the security footage from Mina's studio. He invited Sloane to a private celebration at the docks, the darkest part of his empire. When Sloane arrived, she found Vin standing by a shipping container, the cold wind whipping his coat. Mina was there too, looking at Sloane with a mixture of pity and heartbreak. The designs were leaked from a specific IP address, Sloane, Vin said, his voice a low, terrifying hum. An address registered to your penthouse. Sloane's confidence shattered. I did it for us, Vin. She was holding you back. She's weak. She is the only thing that makes me human, Vin replied, stepping toward her until she was backed against the cold steel of the container. You didn't just steal a dress, Sloane. You tried to steal her light. In my world, that's a capital offense. He didn't hurt her. He did something worse. He handed her a one-way ticket and a folder. Every debt you've run up, every lie you've told the board, it's all in here. If you are ever seen in this city again, the folder goes to the police and my men go to your door. As Sloane was escorted away, sobbing and stripped of her status, Vin turned to Mina. He reached out, his rough, scarred hand tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The world thinks you're a scandal. Let's show them you're a revolution. The headquarters of House Valerius was a glass monolith that pierced the Seoul skyline, a monument to corporate arrogance. Inside the penthouse office, Julian Valerius, Vin's primary rival, and a man who treated industry like a blood sport, spread Mina's stolen blueprints across his desk. Sloane delivered, Julian murmured, his fingers tracing the revolutionary weave patterns. With this collection, we don't just beat Shin, We erase him from the luxury market." The door didn't open. It was bypassed. Vin walked in alone, his hands deep in the pockets of his overcoat. He didn't have a weapon drawn, which made him infinitely more terrifying. He looked like a man taking a casual stroll through a graveyard. "I hear you've acquired some new art, Julian," Vin said, his voice a low, melodious threat. Julian smirked, leaning back in his Italian leather chair. "It's public domain now, Vin. Your little designer was careless. Or maybe she just wasn't as loyal to the silk viper as you thought." Vin walked to the desk, looking down at the designs Mina had poured her soul into. "Careless? No. But the person who gave these to you was desperate, and desperate people make messy deals." Vin pulled a small black remote from his pocket and pressed a button. Simultaneously, every screen in the Valerius building flickered to life. It wasn't the stolen designs, it was a live feed of Julian's private offshore accounts being drained in real time, the numbers tumbling towards zero like a waterfall. "What is this?" Julian surged to his feet, his face ashen. "That," Vin said, leaning over the desk until he was inches from Julian's face, "is the price of admission. You bought a stolen dream, Julian. Now I'm buying your nightmare." Mina stood in her studio, the silence of the room amplified by the soft glow of the moonlight. She expected to feel broken after the scandal, but instead she felt a strange, cold clarity. She was no longer just a designer. She was a woman whose name had started a war. The door creaked. Vin entered, the scent of expensive tobacco and rain clinging to him. He walked over to her, handing her a leather-bound folder. "House Valerius filed for bankruptcy an hour ago," he said simply. "The designs are legally yours again, and I've secured the patents in a trust that even I cannot touch." Mina looked at the folder, then at the man who had burned a multi-billion-dollar empire to the ground just to return her sketches. "Why, Vin? You could have used that leverage to take over his ports. You could have grown your kingdom." Vin stepped into her space, his large, scarred hand gently cupping her jaw. The silk viper was gone, replaced by the man who had looked at her across a crowded gala and seen his only salvation. "My kingdom is a pile of cold stone and blood-stained silk, Mina," he whispered, his thumb brushing her lower lip. "I don't need more ports. I need the woman who reminds me why I bother coming home at night." The professional wall they had maintained for years didn't just crack, it vanished. Mina reached up, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, pulling him down into a kiss that tasted of relief and a dangerous new beginning. But as they stood in the quiet of the studio, a burner phone on the table vibrated. It was a message from the border. "Sloane didn't take the flight. She's gone underground, and she isn't alone." The war wasn't over. It had just changed shapes. The neon pulse of Seoul's underground districts usually felt like a playground to Vincenzo's shin, but tonight the lights felt like jagged glass. It had been 48 hours since Sloane had vanished into the city's gray zones, the places where the CCTV cameras were always malfunctioning and the residents lived on untraceable digital credits. Vincenzo stood in the center of his command hub, a room stripped of the luxury of his boardroom, replaced by cold steel and humming server racks. Mina sat at the central console, her fingers flying across the keys. She wasn't just a designer, she was a woman who understood patterns, whether they were in silk or in code. She had spent the last 2 hours tracing the digital ghost that had helped Sloane bypass the airport security.
"She didn't just run, Finn," Mina said, her voice tight with a mixture of exhaustion and a new, hardened resolve. "She was extracted. Someone scrubbed her biometric data from the national database within minutes of you letting her go. That's not a socialite's work. That's a state-level encryption." Vin leaned over her shoulder, his scent, bergamot and expensive tobacco, acting as a grounding force in the sterile room. He looked at the flickering lines of code. There's only one shadow in this city deep enough to hide a traitor like Sloane, the Iron Syndicate. The name hung in the air like a death sentence. The syndicate was the old guard, the men who had ruled before Vin's quiet luxury approach had modernized the underworld. They were brutal, archaic, and they hated Vin for turning their blood-soaked docks into a legitimate shipping empire. "If she's with them," Vin murmured, his obsidian eyes narrowing, "she isn't just a refugee, she's a blueprint. She knows the layout of our shipping vaults. She knows the rotation of my security details. She's selling the keys to my kingdom for a chance to see us burn." Suddenly, the monitors turned red. A high-pitched alert wailed through the hub. "Breach!" Mina cried out, her eyes widening as a video feed snapped onto the main screen. It was the Northport, Vin's crown jewel, the warehouse where the raw silk for Mina's new collection was stored alongside $500 million in high-end electronics. On the screen, a group of men in tactical gear were moving with surgical precision. But they weren't stealing anything, they were planting incendiary charges. And in the center of the frame, standing under a flickering floodlight, was Sloane. She wasn't wearing sequins anymore. She was dressed in a tactical vest, her hair pulled back into a severe, lethal knot. She looked at the camera as if she knew Vin was watching. She held up a single white lily, the flower Vin always left on Mina's desk, and shredded it between her fingers. "She's baiting us," Vin growled, his hand tightening on the back of Mina's chair. "She knows I can't let that port go. It's the spine of our entire operation." "Vin, wait," Mina said, grabbing his wrist. "Look at the way they're moving. They aren't syndicate soldiers, they're mercenaries. If you go there now, you're walking into a kill box. This isn't about the port, it's about the Viper's head." Vin looked at Mina. For a second, the cold, methodical boss flickered, replaced by the man who had kissed her in the moonlight. "I have to end this, Mina. If I don't, they'll never stop coming for you. Sloane's obsession has turned into a plague. I have to cauterize the wound." "Then I'm going with you," Mina countered, standing up. "No, it's too dangerous." "You said I was a revolution, Vin," she reminded him, her gaze unflinching. "A revolution doesn't hide in a basement while the king goes to war. I know the warehouse layout better than Sloane does. I designed the automated shelving system. I can trap them in the aisles before they even reach the detonators." Vin hesitated. Every protective instinct in his body screamed at him to lock her in the vault, but he saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had allowed her to survive a scandal that would have crushed anyone else. She wasn't a secret to be kept. She was his partner. "Fine," Vin whispered, reaching into a drawer and pulling out a small, sleek pistol, and handed it to her, his fingers lingering on hers. "But you stay behind me. If a single hair on your head is touched, I will burn this city to the ground, and I won't stop until the ashes are cold." They moved to the garage, the Silk Viper's black SUV idling like a predatory beast. As they sped toward the docks, the rain began to fall, a heavy torrential downpour that felt like the city itself was weeping for what was about to happen. The North Port was a labyrinth of steel and shadow. When they arrived, the main gates were hanging off their hinges. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of the rain on the corrugated roof. Vin drew his weapon, his movement fluid and silent. Mina followed, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She pulled out a tablet, connecting to the warehouse's internal grid. "They're in Section 4, Mina shouted, pointing to a flickering dot on her screen. "The silk storage. They're going to burn the most flammable part of the building first." They slipped through the aisles of towering crates. The scent of raw silk, earthy and sweet, filled the air, now tainted by the sharp chemical smell of accelerant. As they rounded a corner, a voice echoed through the vast space. "You were always so predictable, Vin." Vina's voice was amplified by the warehouse's acoustics, making her sound like a ghost in the machine. "You think love makes you strong. It makes you a target. It makes you slow." A red laser dot appeared on Vin's chest. "Drop the gun, Vincenzo," a new voice commanded, a deep, gravelly tone that Vin recognized instantly. It was Elder Kang, the head of the Iron Syndicate.
He stepped out from behind a stack of crates, his weapon leveled at Vin's head. "Elder Kang," Vin said, his voice a low, dangerous silk. "I thought we had an understanding. You stay in the shadows, and I let you keep your pension." "The understanding ended when you brought a common girl into the inner circle," Kang spat. "A king needs a queen who understands power. Sloane has the hunger. Your girl just has fabric." Sloane stepped out beside Kang, a detonator in her hand. Her eyes were wide, manic. "See, Vin, I found someone who appreciates my assets. I'm going to watch your kingdom burn, and then I'm going to build a new one over your grave." Vin didn't look at the gun. He looked at Mina. "Now," he whispered. Mina tapped a command on her tablet. The warehouse's automated shelving system, a multi-ton grid of moving steel, suddenly groaned to life. A massive rack of electronics swung outward, slamming into the mercenaries who were closing in from the flanks. The lights in Section 4 cut out, plunging the area into pitch blackness. What is this?" Sloane screamed. Vin moved in the dark like a creature born of it. 2 silenced shots rang out. 2 of Kang's men fell before they could even blink. "Mina, move!" Vin roared. But as Mina turned to dive behind a crate, a hand grabbed her hair. Sloane had lunged through the darkness, her face twisted in a mask of pure hatred. She held up a single white lily, the flower Vin always left on Mina's desk, and shredded it between her fingers. "Don't move, Vin," Sloane shrieked, as the backup emergency lights flickered on, casting long, eerie shadows. "I'll do it. I swear I'll do it. If I can't have you, I'll make sure you have nothing but a memory." Vin froze. His weapon was raised, but his finger trembled on the trigger. The silk viper was paralyzed. The man who had dismantled empires was looking at the woman he loved, a blade at her throat, held by the sister she had grown up with. "Sloane, look at me," Mina said, her voice surprisingly calm. "You don't want this. You don't want to be a murderer. You just want to be seen." "Shut up. You were always the favorite, the talented one, the kind one." Sloane's hand was shaking, the blade nicking the skin of Mina's neck. A single thin line of red appeared. When Vin saw the blood, something snapped. The cultivated mask didn't just fall, it shattered. "Sloane," Vin said, his voice so low it was almost a vibration in the floor. "If you hurt her, there is no corner of this earth that will hide you. I won't kill you. I will make you a ghost. I will take your voice, your name, and your mind. I will make you wish for death every second of your remaining life." In that moment of hesitation, Mina acted. She didn't use the gun. She used her knowledge of her own designs. She reached up and pulled a hidden structural thread in her emerald dress, a reinforced silk cord she had designed for high-stress tailoring. She wrapped it around Sloane's wrist and yanked. The knife clattered to the floor. Vin didn't wait. He lunged forward, his fist connecting with Sloane's jaw with a sickening thud. She went down, the detonator spinning away across the concrete. Elder Kang tried to fire, but Vin was faster. A single shot through the shoulder sent the old man sprawling. Vin gathered Mina into his arms, his heart racing so hard it felt like it would burst through his ribs. He checked her neck, his hands trembling as he wiped away the small drop of blood. "I'm okay, Vin," she whispered, clinging to him. "I'm okay." But as they stood there, the sound of sirens approaching, Vin looked at Sloane as she lay unconscious, her face bruised and pale. She looked small. She looked broken. "She was my sister," Mina whispered, tears finally blurring her eyes. "She was a weed," Vin replied, his voice cold and final, "and the garden is finally clean." But as the police swarms the building, Vin noticed something on the floor near the detonator. It was a small encrypted transponder. It was still active. The Iron Syndicate wasn't the only power behind Sloane. There was a third player, a ghost in the machine that they had yet to unmask. The rain over Seoul had turned from a cleansing downpour into a thick, suffocating mist that clung to the glass windows of the Shin estate. Inside, the air was sterile, vibrating with the low hum of high-end servers. Vincenzo Shin sat at the head of a white lacquered table, his charcoal gray suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the corded muscle of his forearms. He looked less like a CEO and more like a predator westing before a final strike. Beside him, Mina was hunched over the encrypted
transponder they had recovered from the North Port. Her emerald dress was torn at the hem, a smudge of oil on her cheek, but her eyes were electric. She wasn't the quiet designer anymore. She was the woman who had survived an assassination attempt by her own blood. The encryption on this isn't just state-level, Vin, Mina whispered, her voice rasping from the smoke she'd inhaled at the warehouse. It's proprietary. It uses a base code derived from architectural rendering software. Someone didn't just hack the ports. They designed the digital cage we were trapped in. Vin's hand tightened around a glass of amber liquid. Architectural software? Julian Valerius was a builder, but he didn't have the brains for this. Elder Kang is a thug who still uses a rotary phone. If Sloane was the blade, who was the hand holding it? Mina tapped a final command, and the screen blossomed into a complex 3D map of a private villa located in the Han River district. The architecture was unmistakable, brutalist concrete softened by overflowing hanging gardens. The villa belongs to Adrian Montgomery, Mina said, the name tasting like ash. The man who mentored Zora, and the man who tried to buy my textile firm 3 years ago. Vin stood up, the chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound like a whetted blade. Montgomery, the saint of soul. He's been playing the philanthropist while funding the syndicate's transition into cyber warfare. He didn't want your designs for the fashion house, Mina. He wanted the reinforced carbon fiber weave you invented for the fabric. He wanted it for military-grade stealth plating. The realization hit the room like a physical weight. Sloane hadn't just been a jealous sister. She had been a pawn in a much larger industrial espionage scheme. Montgomery had played on her envy, feeding her the tools to destroy Mina so he could swoop in and rescue the assets from the wreckage. He's hosting a silent auction tonight, Vin said, his voice dropping into that dangerous silken register. A charity event for underprivileged youth. The entire elite of the city will be there. He thinks he's safe behind his security and his reputation. We can't just walk in there with guns, Vin, Mina warned, standing to meet his gaze. The police are already breathing down our necks after the port fire. If the Silk Viper shows up with a hit squad, Montgomery wins the PR war before we even get through the gate. Vin looked at her, a slow, predatory smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Who said anything about guns? You're designer, Mina, and I'm an expert in high-stakes mergers. We're going to walk into that gala and perform a hostile takeover of his soul. The Montgomery villa was a fortress of light and pretension. Valets in white gloves whisked away luxury sedans as the scent of expensive jasmine and champagne filled the air. Vin and Mina arrived late. They didn't come in a standard armored SUV. They arrived in a vintage 1960s black convertible, the top down despite the mist. Vin was in a bespoke tuxedo that cost more than most people's homes, but it was Mina who stopped the breath of every guest in the foyer. She wore a new creation, a dress made of the very carbon fiber silk Montgomery had tried to steal. It shimmered with a metallic, oil-slick sheen, shifting from deep black to iridescent violet as she moved. Around her neck was a single raw diamond, held by a wire of industrial steel. She looked like a goddess of the new machine age. As they entered the ballroom, the music didn't stop, but the conversations did. Adrian Montgomery stood at the top of a grand staircase, a glass of vintage wine in his hand. He was a man of 60, silver-haired and impeccably groomed, with a smile that never reached his predatory eyes. Vincenzo, Montgomery called out, his voice echoing with false warmth, and the lovely Mina. I heard there was some excitement at your port earlier this evening. I was so relieved to hear you escaped the fire.
Vin led Mina to the base of the stairs, his hand firm on the small of her back. The fire was just a clearing of the brush, Adrian. It's amazing what you find when the weeds are burned away. For instance, I found a very interesting transponder. The smile on Montgomery's face didn't falter, but the skin around his eyes tightened. Technology is a fickle thing. I hope you didn't come here to talk shop. This is a night for charity. Actually, Mina stepped forward, her voice ringing clear across the silent ballroom. I came to make a donation to your underprivileged youth fund. She pulled a small, sleek tablet from her clutch and tapped the screen. Behind Montgomery, a massive projector intended to show images of orphans in schools flickered to life. It wasn't a charity slideshow. It was a recording of Sloane. The video showed Sloane in the back of the mercenary van, her face bruised, her voice cracking as she spoke into a hidden mic Vin had planted on her during the confrontation. Adrian promised me the Shin estate. He said if I planted the charges, he'd make sure Mina was taken care of. He wanted the carbon patents. He told me Vin was a relic, that the future belonged to men who knew how to kill with a keyboard instead of a gun. A collective gasp rippled through the elite crowd. Montgomery's glass shattered on the floor, the red wine looking like a fresh wound on the white marble. "This is a fabrication," Montgomery roared, his saint persona evaporating. "Security, remove them!" But the security team didn't move. They stood at the perimeter of the room, their earpieces silent. Vin had already bought their silence an hour ago, not with money, but with the threat of the Viper's reach. Vin walked up to the stairs, one step at a time. He didn't need a weapon. His presence was a gravity that pulled the oxygen out of the room. He stopped one step below Montgomery, forcing the older man to look down into the eyes of a man who truly ruled the night. "You used a broken girl's jealousy to try and steal a woman's soul," Vin said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. "You thought because I wore a tuxedo I had forgotten how to be the Viper. You thought because I loved her I was weak." He leaned in, whispering so only Montgomery could hear. "I didn't bring the police, Adrian, and I didn't bring my soldiers. I brought the truth. By tomorrow morning, every asset you own will be frozen. Every charity you lead will be investigated. You won't go to a cell, you'll go to the streets. And the syndicate, they don't like failures." Vin turned back to the crowd, raising an empty hand as if in a toast. "Enjoy the champagne, everyone. It's the last thing Adrian Montgomery will ever afford." He walked back to Mina. She took his arm, her head held high. As they walked toward the exit, the saint's screams of rage faded behind them, replaced by the hushed, terrified whispers of the people who had once called him a god. Once outside in the cool night air, the adrenaline finally began to ebb. Mina leaned her head against Vin's shoulder as the valet brought their car around. "Is it over?" she asked. Vin looked out at the city lights reflecting off the Han River. "Montgomery is finished. Sloane is in a high-security facility where she can't hurt herself or anyone else. The garden is clean, Mina." But as he opened the car door for her, his phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from his head of security. "Sir, we searched Montgomery's private server. He wasn't the top of the chain. There's a ghost account in Switzerland. The name on the account is Shin." Vin froze. His own family name, the past he thought he had buried, the father who had disappeared 10 years ago, was calling from the shadows. "Vin?" Mina asked, noticing his sudden stillness. He looked at her, the woman who made him want to be human, and forced a smile. "It's nothing, Mina. Let's go home."
Please like, subscribe, and comment.
But as they drove away, Vin knew the real war had only just begun. The drive back from the Montgomery villa should have been a victory lap. The Saint of Soul had been publicly dismantled, his reputation as a philanthropist shattered by the recorded confession of a broken girl. But as the vintage black convertible glided through the neon-drenched streets, the silence between Vincenzo and Mina was no longer the comfortable, weighted quiet of two people who understood each other. It was a cold, jagged thing. Vin's grip on the steering wheel was so tight his knuckles were white stones. The message on his phone, that single haunting name, Shin, was a ghost he had spent a decade trying to exorcise. "You're vibrating, Vin," Mina said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. She reached out, her fingers grazing the sleeve of his tuxedo. "The adrenaline is gone, but you're still in the war. What did you see on that phone?" Vin didn't look at her. He couldn't. If he looked into her emerald eyes, he might lose the Viper persona entirely, and right now, he needed the venom. "Montgomery was a middleman, Mina. A high society front for a shadow that's been following me since I was 20. The account name, she guessed, her intuition as sharp as a needle. It wasn't a business. It was family. Vin pulled the car into the underground garage of the Shin estate. The heavy steel gates hissed shut behind them, sealing them into their private sanctuary. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. "My father didn't die 10 years ago," Vin said, his voice a low, hollow vibration. "He didn't drown in the Han River during the purge of the old guard. He retreated. He let me build this empire, the legitimate shipping, the luxury ports, the clean money, so he could use it as a massive laundering machine from the shadows. Montgomery was his architect. Sloan was his distraction." Mina sat back, the iridescent silk of her dress rustling. "He used your own sister-in-law to try and destroy the woman you love? To kill his own son's heart just for a patent?" "He doesn't see hearts, Mina. He sees infrastructure," Vin replied, finally turning to look at her. His obsidian eyes were bloodshot, the exhaustion of 1,000 battles finally showing. "In his world, I am just a CEO he appointed, and you were an unplanned variable that made me too independent. You made me want a life outside the syndicate." He reached into the glove box and pulled out a small weighted folder, one he had kept hidden even from her. Inside were grainy photographs of a man in a wheelchair, his face partially obscured by an oxygen mask, sitting in a garden in the Swiss Alps. "This is Shin Tae-so, the man who taught me how to hold a gun before I could ride a bike. He's been watching us this whole time. Every gala, every board meeting, every kiss. He was there." The realization made Mina's skin crawl. She looked around the darkened garage, suddenly feeling like the walls of their sanctuary were closing in. "If he's alive then the Iron Syndicate isn't just a rival, it's his infantry. And Sloan, she didn't just find a new ally, she was recruited by her own father-in-law to be." "Exactly. And now that Montgomery's gone, the buffer is removed. My father doesn't need middlemen anymore. He's coming to claim his inheritance." They stepped out of the car and headed toward the private elevator. The elevator didn't go to the penthouse. Vin punched a code for the sub-basement, the vaults where the most sensitive data and the oldest weapons were kept. Inside the vault, the air was cool and smelled of gun oil and old paper. Vin walked to a heavy oak desk and opened a hidden compartment. He pulled out a pair of matching silver-plated pistols, the twins, inherited from a grandfather who had been a true pirate of the Pacific. "We're not staying here," Vin said, checking the magazines with practiced clinical speed. "This estate is registered in the Shin name. If he wants it, he can have the stone and the glass, but he's not getting you." "Where are we going?" Mina asked, her voice steadying. She had moved past fear into a state of tactical coldness. She began pulling the carbon fiber thread from her dress again, the same reinforced silk that had saved her life at the port. "If we run, he wins. He'll just track the patents. He'll freeze the ports." "We're not running," Vin said, looking up, a dark, dangerous spark in his eyes. "We're going to the one place he can't touch, the old port district, the slums where he started. He thinks I've become too refined, too civilized to survive in the dirt. He thinks the Silk Viper has lost his fangs." "And has he?" Mina stepped into his space, her hand resting over his heart. Vin leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. He's about to find out that silk is just a different kind of armor, and that a man who has something to live for is 1,000 times more lethal than a man who only has something to rule. An hour later, they were in a nondescript, beat-up delivery van weaving through the narrow, rain-slicked alleys of the old port. The neon lights here were flickering and broken, the air thick with the smell of salt and cheap coal fire. They stopped in front of a rusted warehouse that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. This was the dead zone, a part of the city Vin had intentionally left off the digital grid when he modernized the ports. "Why here?" Mina asked as they stepped into the damp darkness of the warehouse. "Because this is where the ledgers are," Vin explained. "The real ones, the physical books that predate the digital era. My father is a ghost in the machine, but he can't hack paper. If I can find the original bloodline debt, the contract he signed with the Triads 40 years ago, I can break his protection." They moved deeper into the warehouse, their flashlights cutting through the dust-filled air. It was a labyrinth of rotting crates and rusted anchors. "There," Mina pointed. In the center of the room was a massive iron-bound safe. But as they approached it, the lights in the warehouse didn't just flicker. They turned a deep, menacing red. A speaker system, ancient and crackling with static, hummed to life. "You always were a sentimental boy, Vincenzo." A voice like gravel grinding over bone. It was older than Vin remembered, but the authority in it was unmistakable. Vin froze, his hand flying to the small of his back where the twins were holstered. "Father." "You didn't think you'd remember the way back to the mud." Shin Tae-so chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "But you brought the designer. Such a waste of talent. She could have woven the future of the syndicate. Instead, she's become the anchor that's going to drown you." "You used Sloan," Vin spat, his eyes scanning the shadows for the source of the sound. "You used a girl's jealousy to try and kill your own blood?" "I used a tool that was available," the voice replied. "Sloan was weak, but she was useful. She gave me the codes to your North Port, and now she's given me the one thing I needed to lure you here." Suddenly, the floor beneath them vibrated. A section of the warehouse walls slid open, revealing a row of men in heavy tactical gear. But these weren't mercenaries. They were the Black Guard, the elite assassins who had served his father during the Great Purge. In the center of the line was a wheelchair. In it sat a man who looked like a mummified version of the Viper. Shin Tae-so had his face a map of scars, his eyes two burning coals of pure, unadulterated greed. Beside him, standing with a jagged scar across her jaw and a look of hollow-eyed madness, was Sloan. "You didn't think I'd go to jail, did you, Vin?" Sloan whispered, her voice a ghost of her former self. "The Saint is dead, the Viper is trapped, and I'm finally the favorite." "Sloan, look at him." Mina stepped forward, her hand tightening around the carbon fiber cord. "He's a corpse in a chair. He doesn't love you. He's just using you to hurt Vin." "He's using me to replace you," Sloan screamed, lunging forward, but the Blackguard held her back. "Enough," Tae-so commanded. He looked at Vin, a cold, predatory smile touching his thin lips. "Vincenzo, give me the master codes to the ports. Give me the carbon fiber patents, and I'll let the girl walk. She can go back to her sewing machines. She can live a long, boring life in the sun." Vin looked at Mina. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had survived the gala, the fire, and the betrayal. He saw the woman who had made him want to be a man, not a monster. "You taught me one thing, Father," Vin said, his voice dropping into a register that made even the Blackguard hesitate. "And what was that?" "That a Shin never gives up his throne." He didn't pull his gun. He looked at Mina and gave a single microscopic nod. Mina tapped a hidden button on the underside of her steel necklace. The entire warehouse, the dust, the crates, the air itself erupted into a blinding, white-hot flash. It wasn't an explosion, it was a localized EMP coupled with a high-intensity magnesium flare. "Go!" Vin roared. In the chaos of the blackout, where the tactical goggles of the Black Guard were suddenly blinded and the electronic wheelchair of his father sparked and died, the Silk Viper finally struck. The white-hot glare of the magnesium flare died instantly, leaving a tomb-like darkness in the old port warehouse. But for the Black Guard, the darkness was permanent. The EMP had fried their night vision optics, turning their tactical advantage into a blindfold of high-tech glass. Vin moved like a ghost through the machinery. He didn't need light. He had spent his childhood memorizing the floor plans of his father's original empire. Two silenced cracks from the twins echoed through the rafters. 2 guards fell without a sound. "Sloan! Find them!" Shin Tae-soo's voice was a cracked whip, devoid of the electronic amplification. He was a statue in a dead wheelchair, his lungs rattling as the oxygen concentrator failed. Mina wasn't hiding. She was a weaver, and she was currently threading the needle of their escape. She had slipped into the shadows of the iron-bound safe, her carbon fiber cord anchored to a heavy pulley system above. As a mercenary stumbled past her, she stepped out, looped the indestructible thread around his tactical vest, and kicked the release. The man was hoisted 10 feet into the air, his own weight acting as a counterweight that swung a heavy iron crate toward the remaining guards. "Vincenzo!" Tae-soo roared, his eyes catching the glint of the silver-plated pistols. "You would kill the man who gave you life for a girl who designs rags?" Vin stepped into the faint moonlight filtering through the cracked skylight. He stood 5 feet from his father's chair. Sloan was huddled beside the old man, a jagged knife in her hand, her eyes darting like a trapped animal's. "You didn't give me life, father," Vin said, his voice a cold, final vibration. "You gave me a cage and called it a kingdom. You used Mina because you knew she was the only thing I couldn't trade for power. You didn't want the carbon fiber for the syndicate. You wanted it to plate your own coffin." Sloan lunged. It wasn't a tactical strike. It was a scream of pure, unfiltered envy. "He loves me! He said I'm the heir!" Vin didn't fire. He stepped aside with a fluid grace, catching Sloane's wrist and twisting it until the knife clattered to the concrete. He didn't look at her. He looked at the man in the chair. "She's broken because of you," Vin whispered, "just like you tried to break me." "Kill him, Sloan!" Tae-soo hissed, his face contorting. "Do it, and the ports are yours." Sloan looked at the old man, then at Vin, then at Mina, who was standing by the safe, her face illuminated by the moonlight. The madness in Sloane's eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden crushing clarity. She realized she wasn't the favorite. She was the last bullet in a dead man's gun. Sloane collapsed to her knees, sobbing into her hands. The steel socialite was gone. Vin turned back to the safe. He didn't need the code. He placed a small, specialized charge, a gift from Mina's lab, on the hinges. A muffled thump, and the door swung open. Inside weren't gold bars or diamonds. There was a single, leather-bound ledger. Vin leafed through the pages until he found the bloodline debt, the original contract that proved Shin Tae-soo had sold the syndicate's loyalty to international cartels decades ago. It was the one document that would turn every old guard loyalist against him. "It's over, father," Vin said, holding the book up. "By dawn, the syndicate will know you've been a puppet for the triads all along. You won't be a king, you'll be a traitor." Tae-soo's eyes widened. He tried to speak, but the lack of oxygen was finally taking its toll. He slumped back into the chair, a hollow shell of the man who ruled the night. The sun began to rise over the Han River, painting the sky in streaks of bruised purple and gold. Vin and Mina stood on the edge of the pier, the wind whipping their hair. The old port was behind them, a relic of a war that had finally been decided. Sloane had been taken to a private medical facility, not a prison, but a place where the walls were soft and the light was kind. It was the only mercy Mina had asked for. Vin looked at the bloodline debt in his hand. Without a word, he struck a match and touched it to the paper. The legacy of Sheen family curled into black ash, blowing away over the water. "Why?" Mina asked, leaning against him. "That was your leverage, your protection." Vin turned to her, his obsidian eyes softer than she had ever seen them. He reached out, his hand finding hers. "I don't need protection from the past anymore, Mina. I have a future to build, and this time the architecture is going to be different." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside wasn't a diamond, but a ring carved from the same industrial steel and carbon fiber weave they had fought to protect. "I don't want a queen for a kingdom of shadows," Vin whispered. "I want a partner for a life in the sun. Will you help me weave something new?" Mina smiled, her eyes tearing up as she looked at the man who had traded his venom for his soul. "Only if the boardroom stays white-painted, Vin. I like the light." As they stood on the pier, the silk viper was gone. In his place was a man who finally knew the difference between ruling a city and loving a woman. The war was over, the garden was clean, and for the first time in 10 years, Vincenzo Vin Shen, the man behind the monster, was finally home.